The North African sun beat down mercilessly on the exhausted Italian soldiers. Their boots sank into burning sand, their canteens were empty, and their rations had dwindled to a crust of stale bread. Engines sputtered, convoys collapsed, and men collapsed with them, gaunt, hungry, and defeated. In 1940, 310,000 of Mussolini's soldiers were captured as the Axis front crumbled. For these men, surrender meant humiliation, fear, and perhaps starvation in some unknown prison camp. But what awaited them was nothing short of shocking. When the first transports carrying Italian prisoners reached the shores of the United States, the men braced themselves for misery behind barbed wire. Instead, they stepped into a world that felt surreal, rows of barracks lit with bright electric lamps, steaming kitchens, serving fresh bread, meat and vegetables, and even the unbelievable taste of ice cream. "This cannot be real," one prisoner whispered, stunned, as he held a tray heavy with food. To soldiers who had survived on thin soup and moldy biscuits in North Africa, America's camps seemed like a dream. Soon letters home carried the same refrain: "We couldn't believe our eyes." Rations were abundant, water was clean, medical care immediate, and some even gained weight after only weeks inside the wire. The enemy had become, to their shock, a caretaker. And for many Italians, these American camps were not prisons at all, but something they described with a word almost forbidden in wartime paradise. The collapse of Italy's colonial dream did not happen overnight, but by 1942 the cracks were already splitting wide across the deserts of North Africa. Italian soldiers sent to fight alongside their German allies quickly discovered that their supply lines were fragile and their equipment outdated. Trucks ran dry of fuel, aircraft sat grounded for want of spare parts, and thousands of men endured days with little more than hard biscuits and brackish water. By the time of El Alamein in late 1942 and the final surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, Italy's armies had been broken. Nearly 275,000 Axis soldiers were captured in North Africa, and among them tens of thousands were Italian conscripts, farm boys from Sicily, Naples, Calabria, and the northern provinces now far from home and staring into the void of captivity. For these men, the expectation was grim. Axis propaganda had painted the Americans as cruel, greedy, and indifferent, warning that capture meant starvation or slavery. Many Italians believed it. Prisoners marched through Tunisian ports, often whispered to each other in dread. Would they be shot on arrival? Would they be worked to death like convicts? The shock would come, not from cruelty, but from the complete opposite. The Americans had both the resources and the will to manage this influx of prisoners in a way that stunned the Axis. Washington knew that humane treatment was not only a matter of international law under the 1929 Geneva Convention, but also a strategic tool. Well-fed prisoners required fewer guards, produced more labor, and sent letters home that undermined fascist propaganda. In the United States, the War Department prepared a vast network of camps, over 500 major installations with hundreds of branch camps scattered across rural America. By war's end, the U.S. would hold roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners on its own soil. Of these, more than 500,000 were Italians. The journey from North Africa to America was itself a symbol of the Allies' logistical dominance. Prisoners were processed at ports like Oran and Bizerte, deloused, issued medical checks, and herded aboard massive Liberty ships. These vessels, built at a breathtaking pace, sometimes one every 4 days, carried not only the weapons and food for Allied troops, but also thousands of captives bound for an unexpected exile. After weeks at sea, many Italians were astonished when their ships glided into ports like Norfolk, Charleston, or New Orleans. The first sights and smells that greeted them were electric: the sharp scent of roasted coffee, the sight of bright neon advertisements glowing even in daylight, the endless rows of cars and trucks that filled American docks. From these harbors, Italian prisoners were transported inland away from the coasts where escape might be possible. Trains carried them deep into Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Carolinas. One of the most famous destinations was Camp Hereford in the Texas Panhandle, which alone housed thousands of Italians. Others went to Colorado, Arizona, and Mississippi, dispersed in a network that stretched across nearly every corner of the United States. The camps themselves defied expectations. Each was built like a small town with barracks, mess halls, hospitals, chapels, recreation fields, and even libraries. Fences and guard towers reminded the Italians of their captivity, but the daily rhythm inside the wire soon revealed a startling contrast to the battlefield. Food was plentiful, and the quality was astonishing: white bread instead of the black loaves of Europe, fresh milk, vegetables, and meat served daily. Rations averaged between 3,200 and 3,600 calories per man per day, comparable to what American soldiers received in the field. To men who had been wasting away in the desert, this abundance was almost unbelievable. Many gained 10 to 30 pounds within their first few months. Even more stunning was the attention to hygiene and health. Showers with hot water, toothbrushes, soap, and clean uniforms were issued as a matter of course. Medical inspections were regular, dental work was provided, and sick prisoners were treated in proper hospitals. The Italians, who had grown accustomed to filth and untreated disease on campaign, wrote home with amazement. Some even described the American obsession with cleanliness as excessive, but they benefited all the same. Rates of illness plummeted inside the camps compared to the battlefront. Supervision came not only from American officers but also from international observers. The International Red Cross visited regularly, inspecting the camps and reporting their findings. These inspections kept standards high and ensured prisoners could send and receive mail. Letters became lifelines, with many Italians carefully choosing their words to hint at their surprising comfort. "We eat well," one man wrote cautiously, "and there is milk every day." Such admissions, even couched in understatement, spread disbelief back in Italy, where food shortages were severe. But the Americans were not simply feeding their captives out of kindness. They had a practical purpose: labor. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, provided it was not dangerous or directly related to the war effort. Italian prisoners were put to work harvesting crops, repairing roads, cutting timber, and maintaining military depots. They earned about 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, which they could spend on cigarettes, chocolate, or stationery. For many, it was the first time in their lives they were paid for their labor in such a way. The result was an odd but undeniable paradox. Behind barbed wire, Italians discovered freedoms they had not enjoyed even in civilian life at home: regular meals, guaranteed medical care, wages, and time for recreation. Some camps established orchestras, soccer teams, and even bocce courts, bringing a slice of Italy to American soil. At Christmas, turkey dinners with cranberry sauce were served, accompanied by music and laughter. For men who had endured the chaos of Mussolini's war, these camps felt more like small villages than prisons. The atmosphere of America itself only heightened this sense of wonder. Trucks thundered past carrying mountains of supplies, fields of wheat stretched beyond the horizon, and factories churned day and night. Prisoners quickly realized that the United States possessed a wealth that Mussolini's promises could never match. Some admitted quietly among themselves that the war had already been lost, not on the battlefield but in the balance sheets of production. What began as a march into feared captivity turned into something else entirely. By late 1943, Italian prisoners were writing home that they were in paradise. They were healthy, well-fed, and treated with a humanity that stunned them. The stage was set for an even greater transformation after Italy's surrender, when these same prisoners would be given a choice to work alongside the Americans, not as captives, but as partners. That moment, however, lay ahead. For now, they settled into their barracks, ate their fill, and wondered if life had somehow played them a strange trick. The first days inside an American prisoner of war camp were often the most unforgettable. For men who had stumbled out of the North African desert skeletal and exhausted, the very sight of the camp kitchen bordered on the surreal. Lines of steaming trays were filled with roast beef, potatoes, beans, and bread, so white and soft that Italians stared at it in disbelief. Many had never seen such bread in their lives. At home in Italy, bread was dark, coarse, often rationed by weight. Here in the enemy's prison, a soldier could take 2, even 3 slices without a guard shouting at him. And then came the moment that lives in countless recollections: ice cream, cold and sweet, scooped generously into bowls and handed to men who had forgotten what dessert even meant. One prisoner later wrote, "We were stunned. We thought it was a trick. Could this really be prison?" Meals were not an exception, but a daily standard. The U.S., Army set rations at levels comparable to what American soldiers consumed, roughly 3,200 to 3,600 calories a day. Each man received meat, eggs, vegetables, fruit and milk alongside staples like coffee, rice and pasta. Canteens occasionally sold Coca-Cola or candy, and on special holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas, the Italians were served turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie. The contrast was staggering. In the desert they had gnawed on moldy biscuits and watered-down soup. Here, within weeks, many prisoners gained 10, 20, sometimes 30 pounds. Health and hygiene were equally astonishing. Upon arrival, each prisoner was deloused, issued a fresh uniform, and marched through a shower block with hot water flowing endlessly from pipes. For men who had gone weeks without bathing in the desert, the sensation was overwhelming. They were given toothbrushes, soap towels, and clean socks. Medical inspections were regular, vaccinations mandatory, and even dental work was provided. In Italian villages, a dentist might have been a luxury. In American captivity, it was a routine service. Diseases that had stalked them in Africa, dysentery, malaria infections, dropped sharply. It was captivity, but it was health. The camps themselves resembled small towns. Each held barracks for sleeping, a mess hall, a hospital, a chapel, and recreation grounds. Electric lights burned into the night, something few rural Italians had ever seen. Some men wrote letters home, describing how they could read after sunset without a candle. "The light never goes out," one wrote incredulously. Barbed wire encircled them, but inside life possessed a rhythm more comfortable than the chaos of war. Work filled part of that rhythm. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be compelled to labor, but not in dangerous or military tasks. The Americans took full advantage. Italians harvested crops in Texas and Oklahoma, cut sugarcane in Louisiana, picked cotton in Mississippi, and hauled beets in Nebraska. Others worked in sawmills, repaired roads, or maintained warehouses. For 8 hours of work a day, they earned about 80 cents, paid not in cash but in coupons redeemable at the camp canteen. With those coupons, they bought cigarettes, chocolate bars, soap, or postcards. Many delighted in sending carefully worded letters back to Italy. "We work, but we eat well. We can even buy chocolate." To families struggling through rationing at home, such words were barely believable. Leisure was another shock. Camp commanders quickly discovered that well-fed, entertained prisoners caused fewer problems. Italians were encouraged to organize soccer matches, bocce games, and even theatrical productions. At Camp Hereford in Texas, a group of prisoners built a bocce court and held tournaments that drew cheering crowds. Others formed orchestras using instruments provided by local communities or the YMCA. One camp staged an opera. Another produced plays in Italian, complete with costumes sewn from donated cloth. Chapels hosted Mass with Italian priests among the prisoners leading services. Education blossomed as well. The War Department, with Red Cross oversight, allowed prisoners to study. Classes in English, mathematics, mechanics, and agriculture were offered. Some Italians who had barely finished elementary school left America with new skills, able to read English newspapers, operate machinery, or understand modern farming methods. A few even learned to drive trucks under supervision, a skill that would transform their civilian lives after the war. The psychological effect was profound. At first, many prisoners were suspicious, certain that such generosity was some elaborate trick. Rumors swirled, perhaps the food was poisoned, perhaps the kindness was temporary. But as weeks stretched into months, the truth became undeniable. The United States was rich, so rich that it could feed and clothe its enemies better than Italy had treated its own soldiers. That realization cut deep. Mussolini's grand boasts about the strength of fascism evaporated in the face of endless American abundance. Letters home reveal the disbelief. Censors allowed prisoners to describe their treatment, and families in Italy were stunned by what they read. One mother received a note saying her son ate meat every day. She thought it was propaganda. Another soldier wrote that he had gained weight. His wife laughed, assuming it was a joke. The gulf between life in war-torn Italy, bombings, rationing, hunger, and life in an American POW camp was almost too wide to comprehend. Over time, the Italians adjusted. They rose at dawn, ate hearty breakfasts, worked in fields or shops, returned to hot meals, and spent evenings playing soccer under electric lights or listening to music. Many admitted quietly among themselves that they were better off in captivity than they would have been at the front. A few even dreaded the idea of repatriation, knowing that to return to Italy might mean hunger once again. The paradox was inescapable. Prison, meant to be a punishment, had become a kind of refuge. "This is not captivity," one prisoner confessed to a Red Cross visitor. "This is paradise compared to the front." By the summer of 1943, the war had shifted dramatically. Mussolini had been overthrown in July, and by September Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. For the tens of thousands of Italian prisoners already in American hands, the news spread like lightning through the barbed wire compounds. Some men cheered, others wept, and many simply sat in stunned silence. For them, everything had changed. They were no longer enemies of America, at least not officially. Yet they were not quite free either. The United States now faced a dilemma: what to do with 50,000 Italian prisoners scattered across its heartland. The answer was a remarkable compromise: the creation of the Italian Service Units, or ISUs. These were groups of Italian captives who volunteered to work directly for the US Army in non-combat roles. They were still legally prisoners of war, but their status shifted. They wore distinct uniforms marked with special patches, enjoyed greater freedom of movement, and took on critical tasks that freed American soldiers for combat. The process of joining an ISU was both simple and deeply personal. Each prisoner was given a choice: remain in the regular POW compound, with its steady meals and limited activities, or sign a pledge of cooperation and step into a new life. For many, it was not an easy decision. Some worried about being branded traitors by their comrades, or about how their families back home would view them. But hunger for purpose, gratitude for fair treatment, and a quiet desire to escape idleness swayed thousands. In the end, nearly 4,500 Italians chose to join. Their work was anything but symbolic. Italian service units were deployed across the United States, serving in depots, ports, farms, and factories. In the great supply hubs of New Orleans and Norfolk, they unloaded ships, stacked with ammunition and supplies. In sprawling warehouses, they repaired vehicles, packed rations, and sorted uniforms. On farms in the Midwest, they harvested wheat and corn by the ton. In shipyards, they handled ropes, painted hulls, and stacked cargo. By the end of the war, these men had contributed an estimated 90 million man-days of labor, saving the US government more than $230 million, a staggering sum in wartime. The transformation in daily life was extraordinary. ISU members left the confines of barbed wire for dormitories with fewer guards. They earned higher wages in canteen coupons, often enough to buy luxuries that astonished them: cigarettes, Coca-Cola, soap, razor blades. Many were allowed weekend passes to nearby towns where they mingled with American civilians. In some communities, Italian songs drifted across local dances, and friendships blossomed between prisoners and farm families. Not all Americans welcomed them. Some locals grumbled at the sight of former enemies walking freely down Main Street, but others embraced them. In parts of Texas and the Midwest, Italian families invited ISU men to Sunday dinners. Priests welcomed them into parish churches. Children followed them, curiously fascinated by their accents and stories. A few romances even blossomed, leading to marriages after the war. For men who had expected only misery in captivity, these bonds felt miraculous. The work itself could be grueling, but many Italians preferred it to idleness. At ports, they lifted crates of ammunition under the supervision of American sergeants. At depots, they repaired jeeps, grateful for the chance to learn mechanical skills. In the countryside, they bent their backs in fields, but with full stomachs and the promise of fair wages. It was labor with dignity. Some prisoners joked that they had never been so well fed while working so hard. Beyond the immediate benefits, the ISU experience opened Italian eyes to the scale of American industry. They witnessed endless trains rumbling with supplies, convoys of trucks stretching to the horizon, warehouses stacked with goods in quantities they had never imagined. To men raised on fascist promises of Italian greatness, the evidence was undeniable: the United States had resources beyond anything Mussolini could dream. It was not just military might, it was economic power, organization, and efficiency. Letters from ISU members home to Italy were cautious, but their tone was unmistakable. They described regular meals, decent treatment, and steady work. Families back in war-torn villages, scraping by on ration cards, could hardly believe what they read. Some assumed their sons were exaggerating or that the Americans censored the letters to spread propaganda. But the truth was simple. Life inside the Italian service units was better than life for many civilians in Italy itself. For the men joining the ISU also carried psychological weight. It offered a chance to step out of the shadow of defeat. Instead of merely surviving as captives, they were contributing again, helping to load ships, repair engines, and bring order to the chaos of war. They could hold their heads higher, proud that their labor mattered. A few even admitted they felt more like allies than prisoners. "We were no longer enemies," one Italian later recalled. "We were part of something larger." Yet tensions remained. Hardline fascists scorned those who joined the ISUs, calling them collaborators. In some camps, scuffles broke out between the two groups. American guards had to separate men to prevent violence. But as the months passed, the majority who had joined the ISUs found themselves thriving while the holdouts languished in boredom and bitterness. By 1944, Italian service units had become an integral part of America's war machine. They moved mountains of supplies, kept farms producing bumper crops, and ensured ports operated at full capacity. Their contribution was invisible to the public but invaluable to the military. Behind the front lines, their labor helped sustain the Allied advance across Europe. The paradox deepened. Men who had once fought against the United States were now helping to fuel its victory. They remained stunned by the transformation of their fate, and many confessed privately that captivity in America was the most fortunate twist of their lives. On the night of the 8th of September 1943, a crackling voice came over the camp loudspeakers. Radio broadcasts relayed the stunning announcement from General Dwight Eisenhower and Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. In barracks across the United States, tens of thousands of Italian prisoners froze in disbelief. Men dropped their cards, their cigarettes, their spoons. Some shouted in joy, others wept openly. After years of fighting and months of captivity, the kingdom they had served was no longer at war with America. For a brief moment, the prison camps erupted in chaos, singing, shouting, even kneeling in prayer. But euphoria was quickly followed by confusion. What did this mean for them? Were they free men? Could they go home? Or were they still captives caught in limbo? The answer came swiftly. The United States would not release them immediately, but a new opportunity emerged. The War Department announced the expansion of the Italian service units. Those willing to swear cooperation could step beyond the barbed wire and serve side by side with Americans loading ships, repairing vehicles, manning depots, and harvesting crops. The following morning, lines formed at camp offices. Some men hesitated, clutching rosaries or letters from home. Was this betrayal? Was it dishonor? But as they saw their comrades step forward, many joined. By day's end, thousands had signed. What had begun as captivity was transforming into collaboration and, for many, redemption. The tension between loyalty and survival was raw. In one camp, two lifelong friends argued bitterly. One insisted that joining the ISUs was necessary. "We will eat better, we will live better, and perhaps we will even help Italy." The other resisted, fearful of being branded, a traitor choosing to remain behind the wire. Weeks later, when the neutral friend collapsed from despair, haunted by memories of the desert and wasting away in boredom, it was the ISU volunteer who pulled him back into life, dragging him to eat, to exercise, to laugh again. Their story echoed the broader divide among Italians torn between old allegiances and new realities. The work that followed was anything but trivial. At ports like New Orleans ISU, men set records unloading Liberty ships stacked with ammunition and supplies for the European front. In 1 week, Italian units moved thousands of tons of cargo, shaving days off shipping schedules. Every crate of rifles, every barrel of fuel, every sack of flour they hauled sped the advance of American armies in Sicily, Italy, and later France. Their labor became an invisible weapon of war. The impact was felt on farms as well. In the vast fields of the Midwest, Italian service units helped bring in bumper harvests of wheat and corn. America needed bread not only for its own soldiers, but also for its allies and for liberated populations across Europe. Italian hands picked, bundled, and loaded the grain that would eventually be shipped back across the Atlantic. Men who had once carried rifles for Mussolini now carried sacks of flour for the Allies. Inside the camps, life for ISU members transformed dramatically. They marched out each morning to work details, returning at night to more freedom, better canteens, and the satisfaction of purpose. They earned more coupons than ordinary prisoners, filling their pockets with cigarettes, soap, and even luxuries like chocolate. Some were allowed supervised trips to nearby towns where they shocked American civilians by their friendliness and their willingness to work. In communities from Texas to Nebraska, locals began to see the Italians not as enemies but as young men far from home trying to carve dignity out of defeat. For the United States, the decision proved brilliant. Tens of thousands of Italian captives were turned from burdens into assets. Their labor freed thousands of American soldiers for the front lines. The War Department estimated that the ISUs saved more than $230 million in manpower, costs money that could be spent on weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Strategically, it was a victory without firing a shot. Yet for the Italians themselves, the transformation was emotional. They were no longer simply prisoners. They were partners, however, reluctant. Their letters home carried a new tone. One man wrote, "We work now, but not as slaves. We are treated with respect. We could not believe it, but it is true." Families in Italy, struggling under rationing and bombardment, were stunned. In a country where civilians lined up for bread and children fainted from hunger, the idea that prisoners in America had meat and milk daily seemed impossible. Still, the camps were not without tension. Hardline fascists tried to intimidate those who joined the ISUs, calling them traitors. Fights broke out, sometimes bloody. American guards had to separate men into different compounds. But the tide was irreversible. By 1944, the majority of Italian prisoners had embraced the ISUs, turning what could have been idle months of captivity into a contribution that would shape the course of the war. The night of September 8 remained the turning point. For Italians inside American camps, it was the moment when captivity shifted into something more complex, a choice, a gamble, a chance for redemption. They were stunned not just by the news of surrender, but by what it made possible. In the midst of war on foreign soil, in the hands of their enemies, they discovered a future they had not imagined, one where the line between prisoner and ally blurred, and where the dream of survival became something greater, the chance to seize, help rebuild their own country through service to the very nation they had once fought. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and the long shadow of World War II began to recede, the Italian prisoners in America faced yet another uncertain journey going home. For nearly 3 years they had lived within fences that no longer felt like prisons but strange sanctuaries. Now they would return to a homeland scarred by bombings, starvation, and political chaos. For many, the contrast was devastating. They left America heavier, healthier, and in many cases more skilled than when they had arrived. They stepped onto ships bound for Italy, carrying not only new uniforms and toolkits, but also new ideas about hygiene, democracy, and prosperity that would echo for decades. The most immediate legacy was physical. In camp after camp, men had put on weight, sometimes 30 pounds or more. Doctors in Italy remarked on the change. Repatriated POWs looked robust, with teeth fixed, skin clear, and bellies full. They had lived on rations of 3,2,0,0,3,6,0,0 calories a day, while civilians in Italy had often subsisted on less than half that. Letters from home had described endless bread lines, air raid sirens, and children fainting from hunger. Returning POWs sometimes found their families gaunt and hollow-eyed, while they themselves appeared strong. It was a bitter irony. Captivity in the enemy's hands had nourished them better than freedom under Mussolini's rule. Beyond health, they carried skills. In the Italian service units, men had learned to operate trucks, repair engines, build furniture, harvest crops with American machinery, and study English in evening classes. These experiences, trivial at the time, became precious in post-war Italy. Farmers returned with knowledge of crop rotation and modern tools. Mechanics brought back skills that helped rebuild factories. Even small things like the habit of brushing teeth daily or washing hands before meals spread quietly across villages. American routines of order, sanitation, and efficiency became seeds planted in Italian soil. The cultural shock was equally profound. Many POWs had arrived in 1943, as loyal fascist soldiers convinced by propaganda that Americans were barbaric, soulless materialists. Life in America shattered those illusions. They had seen endless rows of cars, neon-lit cities, factories roaring day and night, and fields of wheat stretching beyond the horizon. They had eaten ice cream, Coca-Cola, and turkey dinners in captivity. They had played soccer under electric lights, staged operas with donated instruments, and prayed freely in chapels. For many, this was not just material wealth, it was freedom, stability, and dignity. That realization shaped how they viewed democracy. Inside the camps, they had witnessed elections for prisoner councils, the freedom to stage debates, and the right to worship as they chose. Even under guard, they tasted forms of liberty that fascism had denied. Back in Italy, they became subtle but powerful advocates for change. Historians later noted that former POWs often voted strongly for democratic parties in post-war elections, rejecting the return of fascist ideologies. The paradise of the American camps had become a quiet school of democracy. For the United States, the legacy was equally significant. By treating prisoners well, America had demonstrated its wealth and confidence. Humane treatment was not just moral, it was strategic. Well-fed content prisoners caused fewer problems, worked productively, and spread stories back home that undermined enemy morale. Axis propaganda collapsed in the face of letters describing meat every day and light that never goes out. The Italian service units in particular had been a triumph. 4,500 men, providing 90 million man-days of labor, saving $230 million, all while reinforcing America's image as both powerful and generous. The effects reached into American communities as well. Farmers in Texas, Nebraska, and the Carolinas remembered the Italian workers who harvested their crops. Children remembered the enemy soldiers who sang songs in a foreign tongue while picking cotton. In some towns, friendships formed that lasted decades. A handful of marriages followed, creating families that bridged the Atlantic. Even after the war, traces of the camps remained. Small chapels built by prisoners, bocce courts in rural Texas, or murals painted on mess hall walls. These relics became symbols of an extraordinary encounter between foes who discovered common humanity. Repatriation itself was bittersweet. Many Italians boarded ships, reluctantly leaving behind the abundance of America. Some wrote that they dreaded returning to hunger. Others looked forward with hope, determined to use what they had learned. When they stepped onto Italian soil, they often brought gifts: American soap, chocolate, canned food, even baseballs and gloves. Villagers marveled at these exotic treasures, but even more they marveled at the stories. "We had ice cream," one man told his neighbors. "We had meat every day." The villagers laughed, thinking he was exaggerating. But he insisted, "It is true. The Americans treated us like men." The legacy rippled through post-war Italy. Returning POWs became quiet ambassadors of American culture. They spread habits of cleanliness, efficiency, and optimism. They carried admiration for American productivity and democracy. And they carried gratitude for treatment that restored their dignity when they expected humiliation. For Italy, broken and divided, these men helped shape a path forward. They were not conquerors nor victims alone, but witnesses. Their testimony fueled a new perception of America, not just as a liberator, but as a model. The Marshall Plan in later years would find fertile ground among Italians who had already glimpsed American abundance from the inside of POW camps. For the United States, the story became a quiet triumph of soft power. Where Germany had treated prisoners with brutality, America had wielded food, light, and fairness as weapons. The contrast could not have been greater. It proved to the world that strength lay not only in bombs and tanks, but also in generosity and confidence. In the end, the Italians who once staggered out of the desert, hungry and hopeless, returned home, transformed. Captivity in America had been, in their own words, paradise. It was a paradise of calories, of hygiene, of learning, and of dignity. It was a paradise born not from luxury, but from order, wealth, and humanity. And its legacy lived far beyond the barbed wire, echoing in families, in politics, and in the bonds between two nations that had once been enemies.